Hello, this is Ecology and your professor, Dr. McAllister. Last week we focused on populations, and this week we're going to scale up to explore communities. Communities include all populations of all species in a given area. In this image, for example, if we're looking here, the community would include all populations of jaguars, different tree species, if there's any birds in there, bird species, herbivorous insects, and soil microbes. Community ecologists often study competition between species. So I-N-T-E-R, specific competition, as well as within a single species, or intra, I-N-T-R-A, specific. This is often done to test the competitive exclusion principle, which states that two species cannot occupy the same niche in the same habitat. In other words, different species cannot coexist in a community if they are competing for all of the exact same resources. This is also known as limiting similarity, where there's a limit on how similar species can be in their resource requirements. One way scientists study competition in plants is to do experiments. So, for example, to plant individuals of the same species or individuals of different species in the same pot and see which one grows faster or which one has greater biomass, above ground biomass or below ground biomass at the end of the experiment. But as you can imagine, this is hard to do for many species. And so understanding competition in hyper-diverse places like tropical forest often requires additional approaches. Scientists will often employ a trait-based approach, which uses the characteristics or traits of a species as an indicator of their niche requirements. So, for example, you could measure leaf size and seed size because they indicate the life history strategies of plants. We know from our discussions of life history that smaller seeds are often good at dispersal, and small seeded species tend to be fast growing and have shorter lifespans. So for leaf size, larger, thinner leaves indicate faster growth rates, higher rates of photosynthesis, and shorter leaf lifespans. Whereas thicker, smaller leaves, think of the kinds of plants that you might see in a desert, okay, often indicate slower growth and a longer leaf lifespan. So you can measure these traits across a bunch of different species and in a bunch of different habitats, and then you can use some statistics to get the similarity of the trait values between and within species to understand competitive exclusion in these larger environments like tropical forests, for example. Community ecologists are also interested in the difference between the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche is the set of conditions within which a species can live in the absence of competitors. Whereas the realized niche then is the set of conditions in which a species actually lives because of the presence of competitors. So when we look at geographical range maps, like this one for a species of ibis, which is sort of a white stork-like bird, what we are seeing here is the realized niche. Okay. To estimate the fundamental niche, we might do physiological experiments to understand temperature tolerance or where growth and reproduction are maximum, and then map those temperatures onto sort of this geographical space to get an idea again of what the fundamental niche might actually be. There are diverse ways species can partition resources in a habitat. They can do this spatially, as we will see in African savanna grazing communities, where different species use different resources across time. Species can also partition resources in time or temporally by specializing in resources that vary over time or divide their time through this activity. So if we compare the hunting period between cheetahs and leopards, we can see that they are active at different times of the day. So the leopard is nocturnal and active at night, whereas you can see here the cheetah is active during the day. Community ecologists also study other interactions between species, such as predation. And one of the classic patterns in ecology is this population cycling between the lynx and the snowshoe hare. As the hare numbers increase, more food is available for the lynx. So this allows the lynx population to grow and increase. And when the lynx population grows to a threshold level, however, they kill so many hare that the hare population begins to decrease, and this is followed by a decline in the lynx population because there's no more snowshoe hares for them to be able to eat, so there's no more food. So then when the lynx population is now low, predation pressure is low, so the hare population size begins to increase again, and so we have one of these cycles that begins and starts anew. Species interactions like competition, predation, herbivory create conditions necessary for natural selection, but also for coevolution. So when two or more species evolve together, each adapting to changes in the other one. And there's so many great examples of coevolution in nature. And before we really actually even understood coevolution, Darwin was sent an orchid species or an orchid specimen from Madagascar that had a very, very long nectar tube, which you can see right here. And so when he saw that, he hypothesized that it was pollinated by a moth with a very long proboscis, which you can see here. Okay, and so this is what the moth uses to access the nectar. So by seeing this nectary there, he hypothesized that there must be another organism with a specific co-evolutionary adaptation to be able to allow it to access this. And it took over 150 years before observations were actually made of the moth feeding on the orchid in the wild. And so this is one example, and there's so many other sort of terrific examples of this. There's all kinds of examples of species interactions, and those can be symbiotic and mutualistic. This one in particular is between acacia ants and the acacia tree, which you'll read more about on Canvas. And the ant defends the plant against herbivory, against other competitive species that might shade it out. And in return, the plant has co-evolved to secrete a very, very sugary, rich nectar, which the ant then consumes. In addition to understanding species interactions, community ecologists will also study community structure or patterns of biodiversity across space, such as across continents, across latitudes, across elevation, or even across time, so during succession. Some ecologists will use fossil samples to study community structure in prehistoric time. So for example, we know from earlier this semester that there is more biodiversity towards the equator, and that this is true across taxa such as mammals, which we can see here, looking at the density of mammals. The deeper color is where they're denser. And here we define biodiversity. We can use different metrics, and we've talked about some of these. So richness, evenness, and abundances. And we can use community structure, etc., to look at these different distributions. By sampling communities across time, we can also understand community dynamics and the succession of community following a disturbance. So, for example, in the tropical dry forests of Costa Rica, they were almost entirely deforested to create pastures for the cattle industry, which boomed in the 1940s and the 1950s after World War II. And then when the cattle industry crashed in the 1990s, many cattle ranches were abandoned or sold to create national parks, and those abandoned pastures regenerated into secondary or successional forests, supporting a high diversity of soil microbes and insects, mammals, birds, and thousands of other taxa. I will let you go ahead and continue on your own. The first study, you'll be looking at the case study of the snowshoe hare, which I was speaking about, and that's going to be followed up by a case study of trophic cascades. And we've talked a little bit about trophic cascades already. The trophic cascades will be the one for your concept map, which is outlined, and so I am looking forward to all of your creativity in this week's concept map. So have a good week, and I will see you next week.